Have you ever heard the story of Jim McGrogan the Wise? I thought not. It's not a story the National Park Service would tell you. He could save others from death, but not himself. Ironic, isn't it? I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Launch. Jim McGrogan was an ER physician up in northwestern Indiana. He lived in a town called Chesterton. That's what the reference in the intro was, in case it wasn't clear enough. Jim graduated from Chesterton High School in 1993 before going on to try 3 times to get into medical school, being admitted, of course, on the 3rd. He then became an ER physician and was very, very loved by all of his patients, family, and friends, as you can see from all of the many, many compliments in his obituary. In 2014, he was working in the emergency room in St. Joseph Regional Medical Center in Mishawaka, Indiana. I do look at all of these and I'm like, man, these are hard to pronounce, and then I remember the name of the Schuylkill River is spelled the way it is. Yep. Good lord. Those who knew Jim closely, as I said before, spoke of him as one of the best men they knew, and his father spoke of him as one of the most adventurous men he knew. And according to a Reddit user claiming to be Jim McGrogan's niece, as well as David Paulides and most of the articles about this subject, Jim was an extremely experienced outdoorsman and snowboarder and was in phenomenal physical shape. Aside from his activities as a hiker and snowboarder, he was also a marathon runner and a long-distance biker. And for about a year, starting in 2013, Jim and 3 of his friends had been planning a guy's trip to Vail, Colorado to go hiking and skiing and snowboarding and just kind of generally enjoy all that town has to offer. And if you're going to be doing outdoor stuff like hiking and hunting, you want to get up early in the morning. And if you're going to do that efficiently, you're going to need a very good cup of coffee. And that's why I'd like to introduce you to Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee from Tablow Roasting Company. Mount Pocono Perk is a coffee blend that I myself worked with the actual roaster to design. So it's got all the notes that I wanted, and it really works well both as a coffee that you're drinking on its own. It's got the complexity and the sophistication that you need to really enjoy it black, while also being mild enough to be enjoyed as an espresso or as a drink with cream and sugar, or you could even make a latte with it and it would taste fine. In fact, it would taste great. Not gonna lie, this is some of the best coffee I've ever had in my life. But now that I've told you about our coffee and how you can buy it at the link in our description or by going to Tablow Roasting Company's website and searching their collaborations tab, I should tell you a little bit about the history of Vail and the Colorado region as a whole. We actually did talk about Colorado history in a more recent video, the Bobby Buys Up one, but that was eastern Colorado. Now we get to western Colorado, which actually geographically is quite different from eastern Colorado, so this whole thing works. Before it was settled by gold and silver miners from 1883 onward, Colorado, specifically the western portion, was inhabited by the Ute peoples. Now, the origin of the name Ute is with the Spanish Utah, but we don't actually know the origin of why the Spanish called them the Utah, so that doesn't help us much, but it is the namesake of the state of Utah. Much like their Navajo neighbors to the southwest, who call themselves the Dene, meaning the people, the Ute call themselves the Nuuchi-U. I think I pronounced that right, but I actually could not find a guide on the internet for how to do it. So again, if I got it wrong, I apologize. You can correct me in the comments. I will not be mad. Of course, this is in the Ute-specific dialect of the Numic language group, and specifically the Colorado River branch. That, in turn, is part of the Uto-Aztecan language group, which spans really like from central western Mexico all the way up into the California region. And the Uto-Aztecan language group is actually the second largest Native American language group, spoken by almost 2 million people today. The Ute would occupy the area now known as Utah and Colorado sometime around the year 1300, but it's believed that they emerged as a distinct group and people around the years 1000 to 1200 AD. And they did migrate to that area. They originated somewhere in the eastern California, southern Nevada region. We don't know particularly where, but that seems to be where it makes the most sense. By the colonial era, the Ute controlled most of Colorado, but were kept from expanding east of the Rockies by the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples. And in Colorado specifically, they lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle, settling in one area to hunt and fish and trap before moving on with the next season. They were also involved in a pretty large trade network, which also included groups like the Navajo, the Pueblo, the Havasupai, the Hopi, the Paiute, the Bannock, and the Jicarilla Apache and Shoshone. Jicarilla also might be Jicarilla, and it probably is Jicarilla. I probably should, that's my fault. I sound like I'm from Massachusetts right now, I'm sorry. Amongst those local tribes, intermarriage was actually extremely common with the Apache, the Western Shoshone, and also I have it written down the Paiute and the Bannock. So these groups intermixed and intermingled quite a bit, and that actually helped them to have more friendly relationships with one another. Relations with the Navajo, as well as the northern and southern Shoshone peoples, though, were not as amicable. Partially, this is because after the acquisition of horses from the Spanish, warfare became a bigger aspect of life. It was easier to get between tribal lands and to do these lightning-fast raids for resources and even slaves that they could sell to the Spanish. Now, as colonial history is often extraordinarily confusing due to the differences in land recognition, the Mexicans actually did have claim to the Colorado and Utah area for a while, but it was still sovereign for the Ute peoples because the Mexicans didn't have the ability to project force up into the region. Those lands were ultimately ceded to the United States, however, by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Fun fact, the United States actually conquered Mexico at one point, and we gave it back. Now, ironically enough, it was not interactions with the Mexicans, nor was it interactions with the US federal government that initially led to conflict, though there were a few here and there, but rather the settlement of the Mormons in Utah that led to problems between the Ute and the Americans. At first, relations were pretty friendly, with the Mormon leader Brigham Young actually getting on pretty well with Wakara, the chieftain of the Ute peoples in that area. Unfortunately, there were two core aspects that led to conflict, and those were religion and the slave trade. The Mormons, of course, insisted that the Ute were part of a lost tribe of Hebrews known as the Lamanites. Part of this was that the Mormons insisted that the Ute were a lost tribe of Hebrews who made it over to America, and the other part was that the Mormons insisted on not having the slave trade. The Ute were not fond of the idea of converting to Mormonism, nor were they fond of the idea of giving up a very, 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 very profitable economic arrangement they had with Mexico. Their enforcement of their anti-slavery policies led to the arrests of Mexican traders, as well as a call for the arrest of Wakara himself, which, as you can imagine, did not go over all that well. Tensions eventually erupted into a series of raids and skirmishes, with the United States getting the better of a series of loosely defined wars, and the Ute eventually siding with the United States against the Navajo in 1860. This series of events led to the relegation of the Ute to 3 tribal reservations, 2 of which are in Colorado and 1 of which is in Utah. Colorado, of course, would join the United States as a state in and of itself in 1876. Denver, the state capital, became a very, very large and bustling gold rush town by the early 1900s and late 1800s. And then a few years after statehood, the Colorado legislature created the county of Eagle, which was named after the Eagle River, and today boasts a population of about 55,730 people across 1,692 square miles, as well as a portion of White River National Forest. That's right, we're back to national forests. Vail does sit within White River National Forest, and that forest is one of the most visited in the country. And despite the vast amount of tourism, this area does still have a considerable number of animals like moose, bobcat, mountain lion, deer, elk, and raptor-type birds of prey. Now, if you're familiar with the animals on that list, they're not exactly the best thing to run into. If I'm being perfectly honest, the one on that list I'm most terrified of is moose. Then in 1962, Pete Siebert, a veteran of the Second World War with the 10th Mountain Division, who learned to ski as part of his training, worked with a rancher by the name of Earl Eaton to open Vail Ski Resort just 14 miles to the north of Camp Hale, where, of course, he had received his skiing training for the Army. After the war, Siebert had actually become a professional skier, and by 1969, Vail was one of the most visited ski towns in the country. So it makes sense that Jim McGrogan, being the outdoorsman and adventurist he was, would find Vail the perfect place to have a getaway. But given that it's a 16-hour drive from northwestern Indiana to Vail, Colorado, he flew there and as such did not bring his own snowboard with him. Instead, they went to Confluence Kayaks in Vail to buy and, well, to rent all of their equipment. I've had experience renting equipment from a ski shop before, and it ended with me blowing out my knee because they didn't have enough helmets, so nobody was able to teach me how to ski and I had to figure it out on my own. According to the manager of that shop, as he was interviewed by David Politis, and yes, that's right, this is a Missing 411 video. Yes, I did use David Politis because he interviewed somebody on camera. I'm giving him credit. Can you stop complaining now? And for the record, I do my own research. It's just that he had the interview on camera. But anyway, according to that interview with store manager Brian, Jim rented a few different items. Specifically, a split board, which is a snowboard that splits into skis. Skins for that board, which allow it to be used uphill because they basically, one side is grippy and the other side is smoothie directionally. So you can go forward, but it won't let you go backward. This allows you to therefore ski and cross-country ski uphill. He also had an avalanche probe, an avalanche beacon, a shovel, and a helmet. All of this was rented. Now, of course, that would suggest then that his boots he brought with him. I mentioned the boots for a reason, we'll get to that later. News reports from the time also note that he was carrying a large backpack stocked with food, water, medical supplies, a GPS, a cell phone, spare warm clothes, and quote-unquote other tools. And Politis says that he also had a second cell phone battery, but I could not verify that outside of his account. And as I said, you might be getting to this point like, well, why did he rent a snowboard if he was an experienced snowboarder? He must have had it's expensive to fly a snowboard from Indiana to Colorado. Just, he wouldn't do that. The group had made plans to hike up to Eiseman Hut, or Eiseman Hut, I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. Eiseman Hut is basically just a single-story cabin that has beds, a wood stove, places for people to rest, and it sits at about 11,233 feet in elevation. The four men began their hike up to the hut at around 8 a.m. on March 14th, 2014, a Friday. At the time, it was approximately 19 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 7.8 degrees Celsius, for those who choose to live with a French unit of measurement. I will not be one of you. With a good amount of clear skies and sun as they headed up the trail. And just before setting off, Jim had texted his wife a picture of him on the mountain with the caption, "The adventure begins." Now, according to the news reports, sometime around 9:30 to 10:30 a.m., the group decided to stop to rest. One version of the story says that they were already 4 miles into the trek, but I could not find any source that said that. I've just read it and seen it in other YouTubers and bloggers' videos and posts. Not even Politis seemed to make that claim. If they were already 4 miles into the hike, just an hour and a half to 2 hours in, that is a pretty blistering pace. But once again, I couldn't find anything that said they were that far along outside of other sites and YouTubers who didn't cite their sources. And it does make sense that they might ask to stop and rest. It's possible that they were not in as good shape as Jim, who may have felt that it was a little too early to stop for a break, but nonetheless, most if not all news reports kind of agree on this. They stopped to take a break, Jim decided to keep going, and would either meet them at another rest point along the trek, or he would meet them at the hut. At the time of separation, it was 27 degrees in Vail, likely a little bit colder on the mountain, with calm winds ranging up to 7 miles per hour. As well, some versions of the story include the detail that his friends were upset or angry with him for choosing to go off alone, according to his friend Andrew Culp. That was the only source I could find for that, but it would make sense given that this had been a trip they were planning for around a year, that they might get annoyed that he wouldn't just wait for them and, just take a leisurely hike. But after separating from him when they took that break, they did not see Jim even once they reached the hut. In fact, they fully expected him to be at the hut when they didn't pass him on the trail, and then he just wasn't there. So they got there around 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m., I don't know for certain which, it kind of ranges depending on your news report, but they pretty much immediately called the police. They were like, our friend is supposed to be here, and he's not here. And his wife had said, don't separate from your friends, so I can assume they probably also figured his wife would be mad. Now, there was one almost interaction in between these 2 points, which around an hour after separating, Jim called for 16 seconds and it was unanswered. Now, this is definitely confusing for me because does that mean it was a 16-second voicemail? Does that mean that he called and they picked up the phone and nobody said anything for 16 seconds? Neither of those make a lot of sense, but the voicemail one is weird because I couldn't find anything about the voicemail. This comes from Vail Mountain Rescue's newsletter, so it's possible that they simply misreported, but there was a phone call from up there, somewhere above the trail, just hours before he disappeared, that in some way did not involve people communicating with one another. I will say there is one contradiction here that I noticed, which is that his parents say he was a very experienced snowboarder, while his wife says he didn't have a ton of experience skiing in the mountains. Those two can technically simultaneously be true, but he wasn't planning to ski, he was planning to snowboard. So far as I can tell, the reason that he had the split skis was so that he could use them as cross-country skis while going up the hill, and then use the snowboard aspect to go down the hill. And then there's a bit of a difficult situation when it comes to figuring out what exactly happened here. There are a couple of very contradictory statements, one of which is that they took the Spraddle Creek Trail. That is via Spraddle Creek Trailhead, and then it cuts across some wilderness on not very well-traveled trails up to yet another trail that leads to Eiseman Hut. And according to a few different trail map websites that I took a look at, this is the typical winter route to Eiseman, but everything also says that it was 4.5 miles away from where he was eventually found. and that doesn't track, but we'll get into that. Nonetheless, as soon as they called the police and said, "We don't know where our friend is," a search was launched for Jim. This actually might be due to a wave of laws that spread across the country in 2009 after the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, which we covered in last week's video. Sorry, 2 weeks ago's video. The search effort was immediately professional and intense, and this is likely because Vail is such a well-traveled tourist spot for skiing and snowboarding and just hiking in general, so the mountain rescue teams out there are fantastic. I believe they actually ran 28 separate missions that year prior to looking for Jim and recovered about half the people they looked for alive. A 50% success rate may sound bad there, but it's actually pretty good. Vail Mountain Search and Rescue deployed 4 teams immediately to the scene, with further assistance from the Eagle County Sheriff's Department, the Colorado Army National Guard, Rocky Mountain Rescue, Alpine Rescue, Larimer County SAR Search and Rescue, Summit County Rescue, Grand County Search and Rescue, and the Salvation Army, who I will be honest, up until this point, I did not know was involved in search efforts. They set up an 18 square mile search area covering basically anywhere that he could have reasonably gotten to, and within 24 hours, they had already logged over 700 man-hours on the ground and 24 blade hours in the air with 2 helicopters, which operate at about $5,000 per flight hour. Of course, nobody is ever actually charged for mountain rescue services. Authorities quickly determined that McGrogan had gotten off the trail somewhere, but could not determine exactly how, where, when, or why. So they knew the thing that everybody already knew. Now, while light snow did in fact fall throughout the day, there is no record of any actual accumulation. So if he had left tracks, those tracks should have still been visible while they were searching, especially that first night. And you may say, Aiden, maybe he just didn't leave tracks in the snow. Well, the snow was up to 8 feet deep. It's between 3 and 8 feet in most places. He would have left tracks. Of course, had he left the trail on the cross-country skis, the split ski that he had, he would have been less likely to leave tracks, but he still would have left ski tracks. So there were no tracks that went anywhere. Or at the very least, there were no tracks that led anywhere significant. They did find a few places where tracks led off the trail, but they were just dead ends. Either they went back to the trail, or they stopped, or it was clear where that person had gone. It just wasn't Jim. As far as anyone could tell, it looked like Jim had just been plucked off of the trail from the sky. Further adding to the confusion around this case, nobody on the trail or at the hut could recall seeing Jim at any point that day. Basically, his friends were the last person to see him, and then nobody they spoke to had seen Jim going up or down the trail. Matters got worse a few days later on Tuesday the 18th when a very, very big storm rolled in and dumped a whole bunch of snow and very high winds and fog and basically reduced visibility to less than a mile in most places. This forced the teams to suspend their search until the next day, and it also meant that basically any tracks that Jim left probably weren't going to be visible anymore. By the 21st, the lack of any real clues or evidence regarding Jim's whereabouts led the Eagle County Sheriff's Department to suspend the search. They simply couldn't justify the man-hours, the expense, or the risks undertaken by the searchers. Mountain rescue is not the safest thing you can be doing at any given time. In fact, it's one of the most dangerous things you can possibly do. And searchers were frustrated for a number of reasons, not least of which was the fact that from basically any point where Jim could have been, he should have been able to see Vail. And by this point, search efforts had peaked at over 110 people with over 1,000 hours on the ground and over 30 hours in the air. And the helicopter aspect is interesting to me, because most of the Black Hawk helicopters used by search and rescue teams, which is what they were using, are equipped with infrared sensors. They should be able to see on the ground if somebody is warmer than the environment around them. So if Jim was alive in those first 3 days when they were searching with the helicopters, he should have been found. He should have been seen. In fact, if he was alive at any point in the 5 days they searched, he again should have been seen by the helicopters. And they searched both by ground and by air for the entire 18 square mile radius, which granted is a huge search area, but you would think that those helicopters should have seen a guy amongst all that snow. Of course, I can't confirm that these Black Hawks did have infrared sensors, but from what I can tell, that is like the standard equipment for these things. Unfortunately, there just wasn't anything found of Jim. No tracks, none of his clothes, none of his equipment, no cell phone pings, nothing, until April 3rd. On April 3rd, 3 backcountry skiers, those are people who ski off-trail, like, cross-country, but just in the wild, we're in the Booth Falls area, which is about 4.5 miles east of the trail that Jim was supposed to be on. And they came across a body located under a 700-foot tall cliff face, which matched Jim. And it was near an ice fall, so basically there's a mountain and then there's a bunch of ice flowing over the side of it, frozen water. The gear that they found with the corpse matched the gear that Jim McGrogan was supposed to have, and it did not take the coroner long at all to confirm that yes, this was in fact Jim. In fact, the entire process of finding the body, confirming the identity, and then doing the autopsy only took 3 days. The coroner determined that he had died due to a very, very aggressive fall, which explained the multiple blunt force trauma injuries that killed him. Now, the Booth Falls area had already been searched, as I said, both from the air and from the ground. And while it is possible that the searchers simply missed Jim's body, there is more to it than that. Reports say that Jim was found 4.5 miles from the trail he was supposed to be on. Of course, that is as the crow flies. That is not the actual way that you would go. This would involve him basically climbing up, several 100-foot cliffs. He definitely kind of, zigzagged around. So it leaves out the sheer insanity of how difficult it would be for him to get where he was. Vail Mountain Rescue claims that he continued up the drainage at Spraddle Creek, missed the turnoff for Eiseman Hut, and ended up making his phone call from a spot just above the trail. From there, he hiked up the creek. There are several problems with this narrative. All reports, every single one of them, says that he was found about 4.5 miles from where he was supposed to be. Problem with that is that the Spraddle Creek Trail and the rest of the Eiseman Hut Trail that they claim he was on at no point are 4.5 miles from where he was found. In fact, they barely get over 3 miles from where he was found. Middle Creek Trail, however, is actually 4.5 miles away, as is a portion of the son of Middle Creek Trail. But the winter route to Eiseman, the one that they're saying he was on, never reaches 4.5 miles away from Booth's Falls. David Politis, on the other hand, seems to think it was the son of Middle Creek Trail, which is different from the other two entirely. And it is 4.5 miles away at one point. So sources can't seem to agree which trail he was on, but they all do agree it was 4.5 miles away from where he was found, which means one of these two things is correct. Either he was on the Spraddle Creek Trail, or he was 4.5 miles away from the trail that he had been on that morning. These are mutually exclusive. His separation story also isn't totally consistent. Police said that Jim had chosen to separate from his friends, but Bill, Jim's dad, said that one of Jim's friends had told him that they were with Jim basically the whole time, that they were pretty close to him and they're not sure when, where, or how he got separated. So it's possible that Bill simply misremembered, or that a friend told the story to Bill and just kind of fibbed it a little bit to maybe sound less like it was his fault. It's hard to say for sure, but all of the official reports claim that he separated voluntarily. Given that Andrew Culp was on record saying that they were upset with Jim for leaving their group, it seems more likely that the official story is the correct one. And then there's the fact that getting to Booth's Falls, even from Spraddle Creek, is no easy feat. Going from Spraddle, he'd have to miss an obvious turn to the west, continue up the creek, reach its end, and still not recognize that he had gone the wrong way. How would he know that he had gone the wrong way? Well, the trail ends and Eiseman Hut is not there. Going from Son of Middle Creek Trail, he'd have to depart the trail eastward, despite the fact that this trail runs parallel to a road, and going off trail meant climbing 1,200 feet uphill that he was not supposed to be climbing off trail. And you might be thinking, Aiden, it's winter, maybe he just couldn't see the trail. No, this is a very well-traveled trail. This is like hundreds of people a day travel this trail. It is packed down. You can tell where the trail is and isn't. Now, if it were not snowy, if this had been in June, July, August, yeah, more of a possibility. But no, the area was covered in 8 feet of snow aside from the trail. He'd also then have to cross at least one creek and descend about 800 feet in just half a mile. All well off trail and with Vail clearly visible down the hill. In either case, he would have known he was off the trail rather quickly after departing it, and he had a GPS to confirm any suspicions he might have had. Even going in a straight 4.5 mile line, he would have had to make climbs and descents of 1,000 feet at a time, multiple times, over and over again, all off trail. Now, had he gotten lost off of the more western trail, Son of Middle Creek, he might have encountered Middle Creek and headed all the way up it, but that still doesn't explain how he never realized he was off trail. But Middle Creek does end up in a little like spot in the mountain where you go up to a ridge, and then you would also still be able to see Vail. And when you look at the comments from the Eagle County Sheriff's Office, they definitely imply he was on the Son of Middle Creek or the Middle Creek Trail. They do not suggest he was on the Spraddle Creek Trail at all, and I'm very confused as to how this narrative got this jumbled. And they also did confirm that the area in which he was found had been searched by air and ground crews. Simply put, had McGrogan taken the most direct route, it still would have been 4.5 miles with an elevation change of 3,500 feet. He would have to have not recognized that he was off trail, not called for help, not seen Vail, not checked his GPS, crossed a creek that wasn't part of his trail, and then he would have had to walk off a cliff in order for any of this to make sense. And then when he was found, the stuff he was found with did not make a lot of sense. Of course, realizing how inconsistent all of this information is, I reached out to the Eagle County Sheriff's Office and asked them if they could provide me either with the police reports or with some form of comment on the case. They told me they would not give me any of that without a notarized form and a fee. Now, you might be sitting here going, well, is that not standard? No, it's not standard. I've never encountered that before. Every single time I've asked to speak to the police, they've either flat out told me no, because it's an open case, or they've told me, sure, here's everything I know. There has never been a time when they've been like, yeah, that's a closed case, but we still won't tell you. I also neglected to mention that he had an avalanche beacon that was never used, and also a cell phone that worked when they charged it and turned it on. So it's not like the cell phone was broken. Also impressive considering they're saying he fell down a 700-foot slope and the cell phone didn't break. Unfortunately, finding any information on what he was actually found wearing or what was explicitly in his possession is almost impossible, which is, again, so weird. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how strange that is compared to the research I've done on every other case we've ever covered. The clothes he was wearing are pretty much like one of the only things that's always covered. So for this one, I had to rely on David Politis, and I have to take his word for it because there's no way for me to verify otherwise. But as far as this case goes, I found him to be pretty much sticking to the record. Politis says that Jim had black leggings, a shirt, undershirt, gray socks, no coat, no gloves, and of course he had no boots, because that's just a common one here, that in these missing 411 cases, somebody's missing their shoes. And of course, because he had no shoes, he therefore did not have the snowboard with him, and also his helmet was useless because it had just undertaken a 700-foot fall where it did not protect his skull well enough. In his backpack, they also found his GPS, his coat, and his phone, and both those devices were functional, which means that he could have called for help or checked his location at any point. And as for the phone, I actually did confirm that via another report that it did work. As for the shoes and the coat and why he might not be wearing them, one of the reasons that's often given is paradoxical undressing, which can explain a lack of things like gloves and coat, but you would also expect him to have taken off more of his clothing, if that's what was going on, unless you're going to say that the paradoxical undressing happened while he was falling. Seems more likely that maybe it was a little bit warmer one of those days and he took off his gloves because he didn't need them and then they got lost somewhere. But the boots are totally inexplicable. You have to wonder if maybe he was actually skiing when he fell or snowboarding when he fell and the boots got stuck in the snowboard and he basically accidentally yanked his feet out of them. But so far as I can tell, the boots were never actually found, and I could not for the life of me figure out where the snowboard was found. It was returned to the shop he rented it from, but I cannot figure out where they found it. It's almost like they are deliberately keeping that information away from the public. And that's really the feeling I started to get as I researched more and more of this case was there's a weird amount of information that is always present, especially in these more recent cases, that just was not there. Especially for one of these cases where they actually did find his body. It feels very, and I know this is conspiratorial, but it feels like they were withholding information from the public. I also want to be very clear, I read like 2 or 3 dozen news reports on this, and any information that was available from officials. Had they given me the police reports, maybe there are dots to be connected from there, but they wouldn't give me the police reports. I'm still going to try and get them, but they didn't give me a timeline that made sense for getting this video made. So all of this leads us to ask a couple of questions, but the big one is, what happened? How did Jim die is the easiest one to answer because it's pretty obvious. He fell. He had a severe head injury, trauma to his chest, a broken femur, and if you needed any more evidence, he was at the bottom of a cliff. All of his injuries were consistent with falling off a cliff. How he got there is also pretty explicable. At the very least, he fell off a cliff. He probably used the split skis with their skins on to travel over the 8-foot deep snow because the skis would allow him to distribute his weight more evenly. And as the skis distributed his weight, the skins would keep him from sliding backwards. But that leaves us with the big questions, the ones that really haven't been answered in any possible way. How did he leave the trail without leaving any tracks? Did he put his skis on just to leave the trail? If so, why? And you might say, that's a pretty obvious answer, to go backcountry skiing. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was to go up to Eiseman Hut and ski down or snowboard down from there, or just to go up and snowboard in the area and then hike back down. Again, weirdly little information is available about what they were trying to do. So if that was the plan, why go off on his own before getting to Eiseman Hut, where I will remind you, nobody recalled seeing him at any point? And if he got off trail accidentally, why did he keep going? Why did he at no point look around and go, this doesn't look like a trail, and I'm not near a hut, maybe I should figure out where I am? Had he looked at his GPS, he would have seen that basically at any given point, had he gone downhill, he would have found Vail. He didn't have to climb all the way up to the highest point he could find and then try and snowboard down a hill. He could have just walked downhill and he would have found Vail. He could have snowboarded downhill and he would have gotten to Vail without putting himself in danger. It basically looks like he went to the highest possible point he could and then just decided to jump off a cliff. How does a person go that far off course when their GPS, the landmarks, and the elevation they're at all tell them they're in the wrong place? So is this one of the cases where there's a ton of evidence and none of it makes sense? No. This is one of the cases where there's almost no evidence, and despite the lack of evidence, it still makes no sense. There are really no pieces, no clues here that, if uncovered, would explain what happened, in my opinion. I mean, at the very least, his motivation makes no sense here. Why go off trail? He had, from what I can tell, a great job, a great relationship, and he had 2 kids. This is also a trip they had been planning for about a year. It's not like this was an off-the-cuff kind of thing that they just decided to do, and maybe he decided to end his life while they were there. Also, if you're gonna choose to end your life on a mountain, there were closer places to do it than where he did it. When it comes down to it, obviously, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that I am superstitious to an extent, and that I am fully of the opinion that there may be supernatural things out there that we don't totally understand. However, there's also so little information here that it's hard to say that the only possible explanation is something supernatural. So as always, please, in the comments, let us know what you think. Do you think that this is a case of foul play where nobody kind of thought to investigate that? Does this seem like the kind of thing where Jim was trying to go missing and did it a little bit too effectively? Or do you think that this was something beyond rational explanation? We'll put it that way. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, you can check us out on Patreon. We have a subscriber tier at just $1 a month where you can get access to the exclusive content that goes up over there, and you can also be supporting us. I know $1 doesn't seem like a lot of money, but there are somewhere around 190,000 of you subscribed to this channel, so it stacks up. And what your contribution to Patreon does is give us the money to improve our set, our equipment, and go on more trips to give you better content, the stuff that you got when we went down to Tennessee with Wendigoon and when we went up to New York last summer. You can also catch us live here on this channel Sundays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time to do these cases in a live discussion format. You can also buy our coffee from Tablow Roasting Company down in Lexington, Kentucky. It's right here. It's tasty. It's delicious. I gave you the whole spiel at the beginning of the show. We also have merch, which you can wear out. You can wear it to the gym. You can wear it on dates. This is one of the gym ones. I mean, you could also wear it on dates if you wanted to. I would. And if you like to catch your podcasts not in video form here on YouTube, we also, of course, do have it on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, Amazon, all that good stuff. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.